Good evening. I'm Nick Bonner for TreeStuff.com. Welcome. We've got a very exciting webinar for you tonight. I'm joining you from my home office, so I'll try to be on Facebook and try to answer questions for everyone. But we've got Joe Aiken. Joe's going to be presenting the history of Arboriculture. Joe is the curator of the Arboricultural Historical Society, and he's also the president of the Michigan Arboricultural Society Foundation. So Joe has this exhibit. He's on the road with it. He goes to a lot of local events. Trade shows, things like that. So if you get an opportunity, definitely check that out. I'd like to open webinars by thanking the ISA for supporting us with CEUs. Certainly makes the endeavor more worthwhile. We're super pleased with the program that we've been able to put together over the last 2 years, and the content just keeps getting better and better. So stay tuned. We've got a great webinar coming up later this month from Nicaragua. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later when I come on to close us out. But yeah, so lots of exciting stuff. We will have a quiz at the end of this webinar. 16 out of 20 passes. The link will be posted in the comments of this stream as well as in a separate post on the TreeStuff Facebook page. So please stay tuned towards the end of the webinar for that. It takes 4 to 6 weeks for the ISA to process your CEUs, so please be patient. You will get them if you get a passing score, and we do submit them. Big thanks to the crew, Carson, Kale, Jake. Without those guys doing all the work behind the scenes, we definitely would not be able to provide this content for everyone. So really hope you guys enjoy it. I don't want to take too much more of your time. I'm going to toss it over to Joe and let him take it away. So, Joe.
Thanks, Nick. Tree Stuff, thanks for having me here. I'm Joe Aiken. I'm the senior RTM for Arborjet, and I was asked to come here today and let's talk about the history of arboriculture. We're going to have lots of really cool things to talk about, so hopefully we can squeeze them all in within a couple hours. We did some remote stuff at home. We're going to show some videos. We're going to go over the history of the saddles, which if you can see in the background, we have quite a collection. For those of you that don't know me, as a senior technical manager with Arborjet, I'm one of the founding members. Myself, the director of research, and the owner Pete Wilder are the 3 remaining guys from the beginning. I've been very fortunate. A lot of people don't know about Arborjet. It has a philanthropic side, which allows me through the last 15 plus years, going on 16 years, to be involved with arboriculture with a lot of great arborists throughout North America and collecting a lot of these artifacts to try to preserve the industry that I love so much. That's kind of it. So like I said, we're going to start off with a short video on some of the primitive stuff, hand saws, axes. Then we're going to bust out, and then like I said, we'll pull in some of the saddles. We have a brand new addition to the saddle family that I'll have an opportunity to discuss where we got it and the date. And then we're going to get into chainsaws, my favorite part. And then we're going to roll into the science side, and we're going to talk about a lot of the invasive insects and diseases. So as arborists, if you're not really into the plant healthcare side, it'd be something to look at. I had some great notes here that over the last 500 years, believe it or not, there's been over 50,000 invasive insects, diseases, plants, and so on. And right now it costs us in the US over $138 billion a year on invasives. So we're going to actually cover a couple of those. A lot of the information and the stories that I'll share with you guys throughout the day came from these 3 really great books, which I'll hold up later. The History of Arboriculture, Don Blair, Arborist Equipment, and believe it or not, I have the history of chainsaws. And even though my wife can't stand that every time I come home I have another chainsaw, she bought me the book. So that helped me put a lot of the pieces of the puzzles together. So I think what we're going to do is that I think we're going to switch over to the first video. So we'll take a look at that. You guys ready to switch over? All right, let's let her rip. I'm in the man cave. This is where I do a lot of the restoration of the antiques, king of the hangout. I got the wood burning stove going. So we're going to talk about the stuff I got laid out right now. The first I want to start talking about is one of the oldest and truest part of forestry and arboriculture is the axe. The axe has actually been around for a long time. And if you think back, it was probably one of the first tools used in not only forestry, but arboriculture also. One of the neat trivia questions is that there is a term called "don't butcher a tree," and even before that axe were commonly used, some of the primitive tools used at the turn of the 19th century were chisels. Chisels were very popular, and believe it or not, meat cleavers. So think about "don't butcher a tree" in butchery. Come back at that turn of that period is where they would use meat cleavers to prune trees. So don't butcher a tree. Very neat trivia. This axe right here, it was actually a production axe for the city of Chicago Forestry. It was broken, it was donated, the axe head was donated to the foundation, and we have a local craftsman, Corey Elder, who does a lot of my axe work and actually handcrafted this handle and mounted onto this axe for the foundation. So it did an amazing job. Another one of the axes, so as we look at a felling axe, which is designed to drop a tree, limb a tree, there's a bunch of different style of axes, and one of the other cool axes that Corey did a nice job on the handle, he actually made it look like it was period, and if you look down it, he actually bent it. So when you're using it, this broad axe to hew a log, you won't cut your knuckles on it. You can kind of see the bend to it. So this is a broad axe. And the reason I wanted to show you the difference in the axe is that we were taking trees out for a purpose. So a lot of the trees that we came down before we were all access to a mill, they would hand hew, fellow with an axe, and they would hand hew with a broad axe and actually use the timber. These beams right here were actually manufactured on my mill. You can see how nice and smooth they are. But there's a lot of logs that you'll see in the old barns and timber frame construction where they have the hand hewed marks. And the reason I bring this up is that we actually were taking trees down to utilize the timber. It was a different time and age as urban forestry and arboriculture was growing. The next thing I wanted to talk about real quick is the saw. The saw dates back probably into the Bronze era, the Bronze Age. You think about when they started finding ways to craft metal. And the history books show that the earliest saws could be 2,000 to 3,000 years old, where they had bronze and they actually cut notches in there and bent the teeth. So they were creating saws that far back. Things have evolved, and after the axe, the next thing that came into play were saws. Now this is a cross-cut saw. I don't have the handles on it, but you can kind of see the aggressive teeth. This is an M tooth or a lance tooth, and these would be tuned and filed, and this would be your tool. So you would notch it. When they first did it, you would notch with an axe, back cut with your buck saw. So this was a two-man buck saw. There's a lot of neat things, and I'll show pictures of it hopefully later, that were in the 20s when there was a shortage in labor. They actually made apparatuses to hold these saws, so you could take a two-man saw and convert it into one. So we look back, way back in the beginning of arboriculture, there was always a shortage of labor. So that was a really neat invention. As we got more and more into urban forestry, and if you think about arboriculture really wasn't a term until the 1930s. Before then, you were either a tree surgeon or a tree artisan. So that would be some of their tools that they had, like the chisel, the machete, and the axe. Next, they started coming into the saws, and then they kind of got into, and these are some great donated items, were actually some of the first type of climbing saws. So you think if you had a really nice saw up in the tree when you're working, they actually came up a way to make scabbards to protect themselves from the razor sharp teeth on their climbing saws. These were donated to the foundation by Jim Feldenauer, who's an arborist here in Michigan, that he had on his in his collection, which is pretty amazing how they're even designed to attach to the saddle back in the day. This is like a new old stock from the Fano Saw Works, and you can kind of see that obviously you have the razor sharp teeth. They're offset, and if you look at them compared to today's saw, this saw cut on the forward stroke. In a lot of the saws that we use today, and if you look, they're all very similar, that today's saw and a lot of our hand saws have evolved. Not a lot of difference other than the metal and the teeth. A lot of your today's hand saws, like this Silky here, will cut on the back. So if you think over for thousands and thousands of years, there hasn't been a big change in the thought and the idea of a saw, other than the materials, the weight, and the way that they're angled and cut and sharpened. This saw right here is so sharp that it would cut you pretty good. And anytime during this, if you guys got an opportunity or got a question, please send a message in and I'll try to answer it. But that's some of the saws that we have for the presentation. The next I wanted to kind of get into material handling and talk about the can hooks. It was pretty interesting. I was having a meeting with one of our local tree care companies, and I was talking about the log carrier right here, and I'll come around and show you. And they laughed at me and says, today nobody's going to use that because if the mini lift goes down, they're not picking the log up. So I'm like, well, why don't you have the log carriers in there? And they said the guys would know how to use them. I don't think that's true because I had them on my truck until not too long ago. But if you look at these can hooks, which are very primitive, these are some of the original first ones handmade that were actually used at a mill or in the field. And this one's actually the neatest as I come around a little bit, where you can see that they've actually, to make this work, and they actually peened that around, probably had a blacksmith made it, they actually had a shim in there. The bad thing about these old can hooks is that when it came down, guys would smash their fingers. So if you look at the design, and even if it came all the way back, it was always crushing your fingers. So the only real change over all the years is they're coming up with this. So here's something a little bit newer, and I did is they actually put stops on there now so you can't crush your fingers. But they're still very close to the original tool that we had quite a ways back. And this is the log carrier that I was telling you about. And if you think about, the angles are still the same, everything's pretty much the same, but technology has actually advanced to a point where we're using different materials. And without dropping that on my toe, a couple other things that are on this is actually some of the PVs and the hooks that we used to use. I have one here that would be used to hook or grab a log. And if you look at the material, again, a blacksmith would have to make this. It's a little bit more modern with this pole. I have one up there that's actually made from a branch, which is about a 12-foot hook. And we're still kind of using them today. As I walk around to the back, again, same idea, same methodology, but now we're using modern materials. Fiberglass, obviously a non-insulating pole, just like wood, energy clearance, so there's a lot of safety involved, and lighter. So a lot of the tools that I've showed you today have kind of evolved to a lot of the tools that we still use today. Perfect. Well, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the man cave. Believe it or not, I go through a lot of wood in that wood stove. And I know we only have it showing on one little corner, but the rest of the garage is actually filled up with saws and you name it, I have it. So I had to push it all in the corner so I could make sure that we kind of set something up so you guys can see. When you go back to the primitive tools that we used to use, as I got more and more into collecting the antiques, I had to learn how to use them. So recently, I was actually even using some of the broad axes and trying to hand hew logs. Or if you ever done a mortise and timber on an 8x8 beam, I got to give the men of the yesterday a lot of credit on their resiliency and their strength to do this, because it was pretty tough, but I'm not going to give up, and I'm going to continue to evolve and learn how to use those tools myself. One of the first books I want to kind of bring up, and I'll put it out here, if you're kind of getting in really excited about the history of arbor culture, this is actually the first book that I picked up. It's actually Arbor Culture, History and Development in North America. If you're interested in some of the things that I was talking about and even deeper, pick this one up. I think you get a kick out of it. In here, it'll give you a lot of the history, and you got to thank guys like Bartlett, the Bartlett Tree Expert Company, Davy, ash blunt, the forefathers that started what we call today modern arbor culture. And those were the tools that they used. There were not chainsaws. And using ropes in trees, which we'll kind of get into in a little bit, wasn't even thought of yet. People were free climbing with a saw in their hand. And if you look back into that time frame, there weren't even automobiles. So there's stories of guys actually packing their tools and their chisels and their cleavers in a tool bag and riding the streetcar. And when they got to the job site, they would hire a team of horses to complete the job. Some other guys that I would like to mention that like Dr. Chadwick of Ohio State University was a pioneer back in that day, and so was Chaz F. Irish. Chaz F. Irish was the company that I worked for that was a 100-year-old tree care company. Started in Cleveland and was in Detroit when I worked for them. And it's kind of where I put my love of history together with arbor culture. I've been in the arborist field for 35 plus years, and I got to kind of put it together, so it's amazing that I get to collect all this stuff and share with you guys as we move along. Another great book, before I mention this book, is there any questions? Is there any questions out there or comments, or should we keep rolling? How we look?
Hey Joe, it's Jake here from TreeStuff.
Yeah, Jake.
How you doing? Shauna wants to know who the authors are of those books that you have that you're mentioning.
The author on this one is Richard Campana, C-A-M-P-A-N-A. Richard Campana, so you can get another picture of this. This is amazing. I wrote them down, but then again, it's probably just put them out here. An amazing book. Should be in every tree guy's library. The next book is actually, this has been rewritten a bunch of times. I got a lot of information on the primitives and the use. And I'll refer to this book a lot when we step into talk about saddles. Don Blair. Don Blair has been kind of a pioneer preserving arbor culture. It's a modern book, but he actually has a lot of chapters and all the chapters of the equipment. And he starts off with the history of that particular part. So Don Blair, Arborist equipment. So we're going to zoom in on that one. Maybe, maybe not. We'll come back to it. I got it. Again, we can get you this if you guys don't capture it tonight because you're having too much fun watching. At the end, I'll have all my contact information. You guys can reach out to me or Jake or anybody at TreeStuff, and we'll get you what you guys need. Great stuff. Again, so what we're going to do now is we're going to jump into a little bit about the saddle. Reading in Arborist equipment, the original saddle, believe it or not, was manila rope, hemp rope. It was a double bowline on a bite. And they didn't start using ropes in trees till about 1917, I believe. A climber, with Nelson, started using ropes. The first one that used ropes is actually the Bartlett Tree Expert. So they were using very rudimentary, and they started using it, if you think about why they had to use it, safety. There was too many guys that were falling out of the trees. I read a story in the Arborist equipment book that one of the guys, one of the pioneers of arbor culture, in 50 years fell out of the tree once. Free climbed his whole time, even until he retired, did not feel comfortable tying in. As of now, I believe ANSI and OSHA won't allow us to even get off the ground without being tied in, but those were the pioneers back in the day. So what happened is that the history of the saddle comes out that if they had every day that they had to get out there, they had to tie these special knots and make their own saddle, rope saddle. Nelson Tree Care Company with Carl Kummerling was kind of monitoring what the guys were doing. So what they did is after they tied their whatever configuration that they wanted, they got sick of tying it every day, they cut it off. They cut that knot right off the rope and they would tie a knot to their climbing line the next day. So that was actually the first saddle. They just took their rope-tied harness, cut it off, and saddle was born. So through the years, Carl Kummerling out of Ohio was one of the pioneers of creating saddles. So what we were doing, and here's one of my newest additions. This is a climbing saddle that was donated to my foundation from Dr. Jim Kilbasso from Michigan State University. So there's a lot of advancements in this if you think about when you're going from a double bowline on a bite or just around your waist or just tying in, is that they actually spliced the rope, wood bridge, and they had a bosun chair. The bosun chair kind of was worked into Arbor Culture because there was a lot of oak barrels available. So they would take oak staves, pull it in here, and that was your saddle. So I got a boat anchor here, and they actually filed, if you can see, they actually filed notches. So as you're up there wiggling, you couldn't slide. And if it did slide, it was kind of very similar to what we have now, is actually the bridge. On this, one of the first knots for climbing, this is a taunt line hitch. So they would use the same line. A lot of guys, not a lot of guys, a lot of old timers still believe and they still climb on this specific knot right here. So that's your taunt line. So you hip thrust up, advance your knot. Hip thrust up, advance your knot. So if you're not familiar with the taunt line, I still like it if I had to go up for a tree because I learned on this. I didn't learn on this saddle, I'm not that old, but I did learn on a single line, 2 half hitches, and a taunt line hitch. And when they came out with a micro pulley that we fair led underneath this, it was revolutionary because now you had something to fair lead your taunt line. So this is the rope saddle. Again, this is oldest. We estimate it probably the 30s into the 40s when this saddle came out. Again, hip thrust up. One of the oldest climbing saddles we got. So at the time, we'll switch back. I want to grab one more. This is the next oldest saddle I got. This is a homemade saddle from an arborist, late 40s, early 50s. So before they were even making production or Carl Kummerling ever came out with a rope saddle, this was an item that the gentleman that was climbing trees made for himself. He had a farm. They were building their own tack for their horses and their cattle. He created a saddle. This is an amazing saddle. Very soft, very loose, very comfortable. You can see the rope legs and everything's isolated. Beautiful piece of history right there. And what's neat, we were talking about carabiners and some of the other stuff weren't even invented yet. So they would actually terminate with a thimble and put the loop in there, very similar to what you do with horses. And you kind of see then obviously it was repaired once, a little electrician tape and a couple wire stays. And that was their safety harness, and they felt comfortable enough climbing on that. So now we're kind of getting into, this is Carl Kummerling's saddle. This is a rope saddle. So again, they started putting D-rings in. The D-rings you could actually put a lanyard on. So we're moving up, we're advancing. Tool clips. Obviously this wasn't on it originally, but guys are actually finding a way to hold their leg straps from sliding down their legs. So now we're into the rope era, 50s, maybe into the 60s. And what I wanted to show these is that, and you'll understand why I wanted to show you this one. Again, a rope saddle. It makes you wonder how long this was still in production. Today, everything has a life expectancy. This saddle is basically held together with wire, extra rope, everything's ripped, and the guy was still climbing on this. Pretty interesting. Obviously, OSHA, ANSI standards weren't invented yet. Neat saddle. How we doing? Any questions yet? Beautiful. Let's keep going. We'll grab to a couple other saddles before we move on. So you're talking 40s, 50s, 60s, 30s. Now we're starting to get into the 70s. So now we're evolving. So we're kind of getting into 70s, 80s. This saddle, believe it or not, is labeled and tagged with a brass tag in 1974. So look at the advantages, the advances, lighter, different fabrics. They were actually manufacturing rings specifically for saddles. Then we started getting into the wide back saddles. Comfort was starting to become a part of climbing. Big legs. A lot of guys still climb on a saddle just like this today still. So we'll throw that down there. And I'm going to bring these two saddles. And if you guys are out there and you're looking at this, and everybody knows what these are, what happened through the years, because of what I've showed you back here, guys were climbing on saddles for so long. This saddle looks brand new, and so does this one. These were donated to the museum by Jason Deal because they expired. So now climbing equipment has expiration dates on it. Because it wasn't used that much, because the tag on there has a date, this saddle expired even though it looks good. And the purpose is to keep us safe out in the field. Same with this one. It looks beautiful, brand new, just can't climb on it anymore. And if you look, we're actually getting more and more into lighter material. This saddle right here with the Velcro on the inside and the release, I love that for me. With a bad back, I can actually cinch that on here. It makes it feel like I got one of the old back braces on. Independent leg straps, new materials, old concept. Beautiful saddle. Okay, any questions on the saddles? You looking good?
Yeah, there is one. Brian wants to know, is the history of arboriculture in the United States or is it worldwide right now, what you're doing?
I'm more focused on North America. Arbor culture started from European immigrants coming over. Not sure where I'm at. Am I on the left or right? So, as the immigrants came over, so I'm based on things that are manufactured in North America, until we get to the chainsaws, obviously, but I'm gonna say North America. I haven't had an opportunity to get over Europe and to see where a lot of these origins came from, but I'm gonna write that down. I think that's gonna be a great trip for me. So, great question.
Mike wants to know, what is the average lifespan before it expires? Are all manufacturers the same for expirations?
I believe it has, I don't even want to try to answer it right now because I'm not sure if it's manufacturer or if it's industry. I think that'd be a great question that we're going to have to turn over to possibly Nick or one of the saddle reps to get an actual explanation on expiration or why they have a date on them.
And Shauna wants to know, along the same lines, is the expiration determined on how many hours it's used or just by the date?
Unfortunately, date, because there's no way we can put an hour meter on that. And that's come up on a lot of ISA and a lot of Arbor Culture chats and board meetings on how can you actually determine. Myself, I kind of eased up on the climbing. I'm not climbing as much as I used to. So technically my saddle could look great for 20, 30 years. But I would never be able to compete on it, and you would take it into your own hands if you climb on past the expiration date. But we'll get back to you on where and when and why there is a date. Hope that helps. But it's a good. What's that?
When did they start putting the expiration dates on the saddles?
It really hasn't been that long, late 70s, 80s, because I started seeing the tags on 74, manufacturer's tags. So mid 70s, they started putting dates on them, but I'm not sure when they actually went to a particular time frame before it cycles out. Another great question. Okay, we're going to jump over to one more thing real quick, is the rope. I brought a few examples, and I'm not sure how many people are viewing have been around long enough to ever climb on manila rope. This line, believe it or not, is phenomenal, knot tying. If you talk to a lot of the old guys, when you first got it, very similar to this new line, you get splinters in your hands, so it's very rough. So what they would do is they take a new line and actually drag it in the dirt for days to break it in so it was stiff and soft to your hand. It ties knots perfectly and they stay. So it was a great knot. But the worst part about a hemp or manila rope is that it worked until it didn't. So you could be on it, feel comfortable, and then it broke. So guys were getting hurt. So recently, I think it was 2 weeks ago, you guys had went to Samson. And I wish I could have had you guys ask some questions for Samson, but rope has been around for over 5,000 years. It's only been used in arbor culture for the last 100 probably. So we have the manila rope, and then we have what's being produced today. So we're not going to go into different strands and everything about rope because I'm pretty sure we did that at Samson, but you can tell the difference. There's a huge difference between what we're using now and today. Another one of the big differences is color. So when I got into the tree business, when I started climbing, we just started coming up with stuff like true blue in lines that were different colors. And I was always taught that you always grab a different line, different color, because that way you know which line to rig with and what line to climb on. So keep your ropes separate and climb safe. Another great advancement, which we started with over the years, is actually, which I find amazing, because when I started climbing, we didn't have, you threw a ladder up. If you couldn't throw a ladder, you threw a Johnny ball for the first limb, you threw it up and you kind of walked up. Or before my time, you free climbed to the top of the tree before you even set a line. What's nice about today and the evolution of arbor culture, we call it modern arbor culture, is that we're not even leaving the ground anymore without being tied in. So not only has the saddles and all the gear evolved, so does ascending into the tree. Some guys will use a big shot. Some guys will use the air cannon. If you go to any of the climbing competitions around the world, guys are hand throwing them. I'm still old school. I'd rather take 20 tries to get it into a tree than to move to something mechanical. But ascending into the tree, another safety advancement in arboriculture. So, let me check my notes. Another thing I want to mention, we talked about these two books, is that ISA produced a video called The Legends of Arboriculture. And if you're really excited about the history, you get an opportunity to hear from the guys that worked this way up for us through all this trial and error. And they talk about when they were young in the industry. And when we get into the plant healthcare and the science side at the end, I'm going to tell you a great story about one of the guys that were in the video. And if you get the video, you can hear from himself. Some of the stuff that they did back in the day, and thank God we're not doing it today. So again, Legends of Arboriculture, gave you a couple reference on two great books. And if there's no more questions about saddles and ropes, I think we're going to jump over to the chainsaw video. What do you guys think? Perfect. I love chainsaws. I've always have. And my love of chainsaws got me into the business probably late 70s, early 80s. Even before I was in high school, I worked at an orchard and we were pruning trees. So I got to play around with chainsaws when I was 13 or 14. And I've always loved it. Guide, power tools, all the fun stuff. And I followed it all the way through my career. So what I did is I put out an array of chainsaws to kind of go over the evolution and kind of talk about some really neat trivia points that may be on the test, may not, but pay attention. All right, so let's start over here. This is a Maul chainsaw. A lot of guys have heard this saw before. Maul was actually a machine or a tool company out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This saw right here is probably my oldest saw in the collection. Pretty exciting. It's big, it's solid. Built, it's probably a 36 or 1937. I really haven't been able to track the serial number yet, but I'm working on it. The neat thing about this is that this is even before recoil starters. So you had to take a little rope. This wrapped along the flywheel back here in your notch. And what's nice about this, great compression and good spark. If I got this cleaned up, this saw would probably run. Throttle. Because you're on a float bowl, very similar to a tractor, you can't turn these old saws sideways or they stall out. So to get around that, if you look down here, a lot of these old saws had a lock where you could turn the whole power head, not the power head, but the bar and chain sideways. So that power head stayed straight, but the bar could turn sideways. So if you look at the size of this saw, you're only cutting 24 inches for a saw this big. Neat old saw, all intact, ready to roll. Next, again, 30s. Now we're stepping into the 40s. This saw right here is on loan by Paul Schwartz. Paul Schwartz is the retired forester for Michigan State University. He was in charge of MSU's campus trees for 29 years. He had this in his barn for 30 plus years. Before Paul worked at MSU, he had a saw repair shop, and he had this in his, I think his brother got it, but this was in his barn for a long time, and because of sweating and everything, this one kind of tightened up and seized up. I recently put some oil in the pistons so we can break this up. This ran before it seized. This would be a neat saw to get going. This saw is actually manufactured by Henry Diston. If anybody knows classic woodworking tools, Henry Diston was a high-end handsaw company. They got into the game during World War II, and they teamed up with Mercury boat motors. This is a Mercury engine from Mercury boat motors with Henry Diston. Another neat thing about this, being that it's from World War II, and you can notice the olive drab, is that if you pan in on the teeth, the chain is a lot different than the chisel tooth chain that we're familiar with today. This is the original chain for this saw. I have in the case, it looks like a coffin, but the case for this, the original case still, has two extra chains that are still packed in cosmoline, which was a grease that they packed a lot of stuff shipped for World War II. An amazing saw that I hope that we can get free and run one day. 30s, 40s. Now we're jumping into McCullough. McCullough is a West Coast saw company. This is a McCullough, not model 99. Again, as we're looking into, these are all still 1, 2, 3. These are two-man saws. And if Amy pans back, you can see that most of these bigger, older saws have an assist handle where you have a second operator on the saw because of the length and the weight. And this was no different. So 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, this was manufactured. Here's another two-man saw. Again, this one and this one, because of the carburation, we could not turn the saw sideways. So you had to break free the gearbox and the chain and turn it sideways to make any horizontal cuts. The next, as McCullough was growing, Homelight got into the game. This is a Homelight Super Whiz. I threw this in here. Obviously, it's not a big two-man saw, bigger saw, bigger, wow. But I put this in here because this is a very popular saw. Now, saws were getting smaller and the horsepower was getting bigger, so you could have a smaller saw with high horsepower. And this was really neat when I got this one because of the type of bar it had on it. This has a bow saw, like a bow saw blade on it. Lighter, it ended up being great for brush, and then it just kind of phased out. And I'm not really sure why. I've never cut with this one to see how it acted. So the Homelight Whiz was kind of, again, 50s and the 60s. One of the neat trivias that might be on the test too is that Homelight. I was recently asked, Homelight, was it designed for a light saw for a homeowner? Actually, no. And I found out recently that Homelight stands for Homelight. they had started off as a generator company, Home Light, generating a generator that would light your house. So they got into the saw company. This saw right here is a 1978-79 1130 Super G. This saw is getting into clutches. Again, no chain brakes. So far, we haven't even got in chain brakes, so a lot of the safety issues or safety items on this for personal protection aren't on these saws. This saw was recently went through by a great old-time mechanic that used to work on these back in the day. This saw runs phenomenal. We made some passes with this, so hopefully with some of these other saws we'll get them running, we can show the difference. A lot of guys get nervous about, oh, I would never hang on to that other handle. You'd be amazed at the horsepower in these compared to today are a lot less, but the RPMs are a lot less. So it's really not as scary as you think holding on to the other end. So Home Light 70s. Now we're going to step into some of the more familiar saws. Husqvarna. I threw this one in there because we got it in the 70s, and this is the 80s. This is a Husqvarna 3120, 1989. 1989 is the 300th anniversary, and here's a sticker that they put on the saw. The 300th anniversary of Husqvarna. Now, Husqvarna didn't make chainsaws for 300 years, obviously, but this is their 300th anniversary for that year. Husqvarna started in, I believe it's 1959 with the Model 90. And that saw looked so revolutionary at that time that it would probably fit in today with a lot of the way the saws look today. So this is an amazing saw. And then we step into steel. And I wanted to throw this in here. This is the newest saw in the collection. This is probably 5 years old. As you can see, as we went down the line from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you can see the size of the saw getting smaller and the horsepower going up. These two saws down here, as though they're not heavy, very powerful compared to what we had back in the day. A little other history. Steel. Steel chainsaws are from the late 20s. I believe it's 1927, 1928. If you look into the record books, steel was not the very first chainsaw manufacturer. The credit actually goes to Dolmar, which is another German manufacturer. I believe there's a year apart. But steel found the process very similar to Henry Ford, mass-produced their chainsaws and made it more available than Dolmar did. Because of steel, it kind of pushed the world into learning in manufacturing saws, and because of steel, everybody in the U.S., as the GIs were coming home from World War II, every tank in the German army had a steel chainsaw on it. Engineers over the U.S. started manufacturing, trying to recreate that. So steel had a lot of important parts of the evolution of the saw throughout the world. One of the neatest things is that, again, when you look into chainsaw history, one of the first things that comes up is the endless link chain. And the endless link chain, like on all these saws, they're like a bicycle chain, they're all linked together, was designed in the late 1800s by a doctor. The doctor actually created a bone saw with an endless link. So the chain was developed or invented long before the saw ever was. And at the turn of the 19th century into the 1920s is when they were experimenting on putting it onto a power head. And that's where Dolmar gets the credit for being the first person to put a power head onto an endless chain. Like I said, it's very close at the exact time that Andreas Steele did the exact same thing. So there were, through this time period, there was a lot of other manufacturers that come and went. And as our collection grows and the Foundation Museum grows, we're going to continue to try to gather other very important saws within that period. So if you guys got something laying around that would look good in a museum, or you guys want to donate something, Let us know. We'll get your name on it. We'll put it in the museum, and we'll show and continue to build the evolution of urban forestry for the world to see. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was really, really tough for me to cut that video short. If you look at the saw collection through the years, it's been growing steadily. We started, we kind of briefly talked about, I started a nonprofit, the Arboricultural Society of Michigan. We started a foundation, and plus we did the Historical Society of Arboriculture. And it's growing. So a lot of these saws, I was talking about coming here and talking about the history of arboriculture, then I got an email that a guy had another couple more mall saws that they wanted to donate to the foundation. The foundation eventually plans on having all this stuff at the historic sawmill in Detroit on a state park for the world to see. And the reason I picked that spot to move forward is that what we do on a day-to-day basis is pretty amazing, and I love this industry, and I'm going to retire in the green industry, is we're going to have an opportunity to show the world what we do and how we evolved to what we're at. And just so you know that last year this state park had over 4 million visitors. So if this happens, we have an opportunity to show 4 million people what we do on a day-to-day basis. So that's kind of why I'm pushing for this continue to move. Is there any questions? Anything that you think we can cover? Jake, how do we look?
Yeah, we've got a couple here. Gerson Nairi is asking, are there 4 different depths on that distal?
Depths? I'm not sure what he means by depths.
Okay.
On the distal, I mean, there are different lengths of bars. You could get them with different sized bars, but I'm not sure about depths. Are they depths on the chain, or I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to.
Okay.
So if he throws another question out, let's jump back in there and answer
Gerson's
it.
got another question. So when was the first chain brake implemented on a commercially available chainsaw?
Oh my God, it's got to be in the 80s. Because I have a couple Mini-Max. Mini-Max was one of the first top handle saws that McCulloch came out with, and they were in the 70s, and they didn't have chain brakes on them. So the first saw that ever did, and when, I don't know. Jake, let's write that one down. I think that'd be a great one to reach out to one of the chain or the saw manufacturers.
Okay.
Great question. Safety first, chain brakes. I never thought of it. Good one. We'll find that out for you. Any other?
When was what would you say, in your opinion, when you look at the timeline of these chainsaws, what was the one that shook the industry? What was the one that said everybody, like the Cabbage Patch doll, remember everybody was crazy, everybody wanted one. What was the chainsaw that everybody said, this one's amazing?
I think that's why steel gets so much credit. Andreas Steel created an industry that spurred it all. And so I'm gonna have to say steel is probably the one saw because all the GIs that were coming back from World War II, they all wanted a chainsaw. This is their first exposure to it. And because of that excitement and sending saws home after the war, that's what started the craze. So you have to say again, World War II, an economic boom post-World War II, not only did it spur, the excitement or the revelation into pesticides, because we started getting into insects and disease management, it also spurred chainsaws, and I think it has to be steel, if I had to put a name on somebody. We talked a little bit about top handle saws, and we had one sitting on the shelf, so we have a top handle saw here. So looking at the designs and the top handle saws, again, in the 70s, early 70s, McCulloch started that craze with the top handle saw, and we're still kind of going into it. Husqvarna, believe it or not, 300-year-old company, didn't start manufacturing chainsaws until 1959. I believe I covered that in the video, but you know, as far as advances they've done a great job since they've been in the chainsaw industry.
Talking about the MS200 or the Contra, the 200T.
Okay, they may have been the first ones with the chain brake.
Just as far as that chainsaw that really kind of hit the market running.
That's a great point, because I still have a lot of guys asking if you find one, let me know. So yeah, steel. They were good saws. They're still great saws. All right. So since we cover the chainsaws, and like I said, I could go on chainsaws forever. Almost forgot. So I told you about a book. I'm going to show you my last book I brought to share with you. Is again, I got, if it wasn't for a good friend of mine that had a barn that it's probably the size of their showroom here. If I didn't have that barn, there's no way I could hold everything that I have for the history of arboriculture. And my wife, who I love very, very much, gives me a hard time all the time about all the saws I got. And every time I come home, the big Homelight 1130G was donated to me by the city of Chicago Forestry for the museum. And when I came home, they had actually had 6 of those saws they donated because of the safety and OSHA. They can't use them anymore. One of them was actually still in the box, brand new, that never got used from 1978. So I was very fortunate with the museum, with the permission from Arborjet to continue this endeavor, that I picked up those great saws. So my wife knows I love it. She's not going to get away from it. So here's another book that my wife actually got me. Chainsaws, A History by David Lee. And it goes through everything you could possibly ever imagine about all the different chainsaw companies. We talk about the gas-powered chainsaw. Again, Stihl and Dulmar came out around the same time in 1927. But the very first chainsaw that Stihl launched in 27 was electric. So that's where Dulmar gets the credit for being the first gas-powered chainsaw. They were both in the same year, and I think 1 year later, Stihl did come out with the gas saw. But if you get into this, it's amazing. They did a great job on the history of chainsaws. So if you're a chainsaw nut like me, you gotta have this book. There's one page in here that Henry Diston saw that was for World War II. They have the owner's manual in there because it was during World War II. They actually had the pamphlet in the owner's manual that was in the case on how to destroy it so it didn't get into enemy hands, because they felt that it was the cutting edge of science, that they didn't want any enemy hands getting a handle of that. So the GIs, if they had to leave it, they had to blow it up and destroy it any way they possibly can.
2 more questions.
Yes, sir. Let them rip.
How did some of those bigger saws in the video avoid, how did the users avoid kickback so much?
I think one of the kickbacks, a kickback on a saw is always at the kickback corner in the nose. The big Homelight that I just ran is amazing as big and powerful that saw was. I never felt like it was going to kick back on me, but because the aggressive teeth, it had a true 404 chain on there. Today's saws, you can kind of feather your way in. There's no feathering your way in there. You gas it, you go, and it sucks you into the log, so you got to be hanging on to it. But I've never felt the kickback on it. But you had to hang on to it. That saw was running. And when it ran, the chips were flying, and there's just the vibration, the noise. Those saws, the noise on those saws were just astronomical. And I can barely hear, and it bothers a lot of people. That's from chippers and chainsaws my whole life, that there's certain things I can't hear. And that saw actually hurt my ears. But kickback, I never felt like I was worried about it. And another thing is it's got the one-hand assist on there, so you never hit that top corner of the roundover where the teeth is exposed to get the high kickback.
And then David Yarborough is asking, do you think that fuel injection will be revolutionary on chainsaws?
I think so. I believe they're already playing around with it. Self-tuning, electronic ignition, fuel injected. If they can make them safer, more fuel efficient, and more reliable, I'm for it. But I'm almost positive they're already messing around with it. So that's a great question As you can see through the years, they're still evolving. You know, they're pretty amazing tools that we get to play with every day. So, okay. So now that like I said, I could talk about chainsaws all night, but we're going to step into the next phase and then get another Q&A and then get you guys all excited about the quiz. Just so you know, I stayed up last night going over the quiz. I'm pretty excited about it. I'm pretty excited for you guys to take it. And I got 2 wrong. I wrote the quiz and got 2 wrong. So
You had a slip of the finger.
One was a slip of the finger. So hopefully I covered everything, and we're going to cover everything in the rest. So next, we're going to get into plant health care. And if I had to say there's one person that we all know who's no longer with us that was key to modern arboriculture and insect and disease management, would be Alex Shigo. One of Alex Shigo's biggest claim to fame is he said he'd take more trees down than he ever saved. But he was doing the research and trying to figure out not only just insects and diseases and their effects on trees. He was the kind of the pioneer that got into decay in the effects on trees. Because I think we probably, if you've climbed trees for a living, you probably got into a tree that's kind of sketchy and maybe you shouldn't. And we're going to talk about some of his inventions in the 50s and 60s that were designed to try to detect that. Because you really can't see what's inside the center of the tree. So we have to use our experience to determine when a tree's safe to climb and when it's not. So thank you for Alex Shigo for everything that he's done. But if you look into the history, and we talked about 500 years and all the invasive pests, we're only going to talk about 3 or 4 of them, and then we'll talk about one of the brand new ones. The very first major serious problem was Gypsy Moth. In 1880, there was a French scientist that lived in Medford, Mass. This was post-Civil War, things were good. He wanted to create a strain of silk. So he brought these moths in from Europe. And he had them rearing in his greenhouse, and it was going good. There was a storm, a tree fell, believe it or not, a branch fell, broke the window out of his greenhouse, and all the moths flew out. He actually called the city and said, this is what happened, and they actually thought that, don't worry, don't got to worry about it, no big deal. It took about 10 years till it got to a point where they were like, oh my God, what do we do? And it was all because of that. The interesting thing is that the gentleman that had that, and I forgot his name, but he went back to France and died and never knew the trail of Gypsy Moth in the United States that he created. Another great thing about it is that it's been 1880. It's already been a round circle, and now it's back to Medford, Mass. So it's pretty amazing the resiliency of some of these invasive insects. So Gypsy Moth taught us a lot, and there's still a lot of education on it. Now that it's back in the Boston metropolitan area, there's a lot of science going on in trying to find modern solutions. In an agricultural situation, they're still relying on aerial applications. They've got away from pesticides and are trying to use more biologicals so they don't shock the ecosystem, but it's such a devastating pest, if you've ever been involved with Gypsy Moth, that they're still trying to continue to find the best way to control them. The next groundbreaking pest was Dutch elm disease. Dutch elm disease was actually discovered, I believe, in the Netherlands, 1920s. And in the 1920s into the 1930s, a lot of the organizations like NAA, or National Shade Tree Conference, which now is ISA, there was a lot of discussion back in the 20s about this new disease. And if you think back to the cities, that's all they were planted with were elms. Every big major city had elm-lined streets. So they were very concerned about this pest. There's a prominent arborist, Chas F. Irish, and that's, again, where I got my excitement about the history of arboriculture, because I worked for him. He was the one that discovered it in 1930 in Cleveland, Ohio. So now, the pest is here. So what do? That was a big kick which we're going to kind of cover in a little bit, that's when we started trying to find out what product we would use to control this vascular wilt. We're still battling it. It's still here. There are still trees that have been preserved by treatment, and there's trees that are still dying, and it's still cyclic. The pathogen that kills these trees, that vascular wilt, Dutch elm disease, is carried on the back of an elm bark beetle. So elms are cyclic. So they die out, they reseed, and then 20 and 30 years when they get big again, the beetle comes back and recycles that pathogen. I have a couple elm trees by my house in Detroit that finally got big and beautiful. They weren't mine. I talked to my neighbor about them. Guess what? They died. So, Dutch elm disease, Chas F. Irish, 1930. And we're still battling that one today. Another neat thing is that when we look at our forefathers, I brought a soil test kit. And I had some other really cool things, but I didn't bring. But a lot of the things that we did in the forefathers did as they were kind of building this industry, we kind of got a gap, and now we're doing it again. The trend in arboriculture right now is going back to soil health, tree health. Soil's healthy, tree's healthy. We don't have to use as much insecticides or fungicides. And if you do, and you've done everything you can to keep the tree healthy, the trend right now is leaning towards stem injection. Trunk injection is not new. You guys had an opportunity to have Trent Dix from Arborjet come in maybe a month or so ago and talk about plant health care. So I'm not going to get into the X's and O's, but we're going to kind of talk about how it started and how we evolved. Trunk injection, the very first application that was dated was actually by Leonardo da Vinci, about 300 years ago, 400 years ago. He actually came up with the idea that he had an orchard and he had peasants stealing his apples. So he randomly went out there and injected arsenic into random apple trees to deter peasants. So you think about that, in one sense, it's brilliant. You know, if you want your apples, we're going to save them. In the second, it's kind of absurd that he had the forefront vision to think that if he put something vascular into the vascular system of the tree, that it would make it through the whole plant and end up in the apple. Believe it or not, I've never seen a study that actually confirmed if he did that, did it create a poison apple or not. But I think that's a neat idea. I'm going to have to check that one out. So before we get into trunk injections, I wanted to talk about, go back to Alex Shigo. One of the things that'll probably resonate with a lot of people is this device right here. ISA recently have came out with, we'll zoom in on this in a minute so you guys can kind of see it. But this is on loan from Purdue Forestry, Lindsay Purcell. Kind of shows some of the new tools. And believe it or not, this is not the newest one. They actually had one that was older, that was analog. So what we did is, as a climber, when to climb a tree and when not to climb a tree. So there's still a lot of study on decay. So Alex Shigo knew that, and he invented this. It's called the Shigometer. And recently, I was out at an event out in British Columbia, and I got to talk to Alex Shigo's daughter about this, and she actually has some owner's manuals for these. This one's a complete kit. What I thought was amazing, let me see. I hope my kids didn't leave it on. Oh, still works. So what this device did, and this probably came out 60s, is that this was set up to the tree. And what we're doing now is we're actually running electric current. So we'd have a probe on either side of the tree, and we'd run an electric current from one probe to the other. And because the tree's vascular system the xylem is full of water and moisture, if the tree was intact, the current would go right through it and come up on the probe. Then you would check resistance. So that was a revolutionary breakthrough. And I'm not sure why these two didn't take off. But there's a new product out now that we're using today, which is pretty neat. So same principle. Again, we're doing pass, no pass, or pass, fail. If a tree has decay. So one of the newest systems out there actually clips to this. You put it all on either side of the tree, and you use a machine that's calibrated to pass electricity through that. And again, there's a grid, and it'll tell you by how long it takes to go from A to B. Tree check, very neat new device. We'll set this over there. And now, because of the beginning stages of trying to detect tree decay, safety, level 3 track survey on a tree would include something like this. And one of the newest things that we got coming out right now is tomography, which is sonar. Put a series around and you pass a sonar wave through it. And you can actually create a 3D view on the inside of the tree. Okay. We okay, guys? Everything good? All right. So, shigometer, tree check, sonogram. Right now, the unfortunate thing with sonogram is I think that it may, the equipment may be a little expensive to be on a day-to-day base, but there are companies that will provide that service if you guys think it's necessary. Okay, let's step into, let's talk a little bit more about tree injection. Tree injection has evolved, and I have to say that the pest that we're battling now, and it's pretty much already kind of blown through Indy in the Midwest, is emerald ash borer. We all know emerald ash borer, we've all talked about it, but because it was the newest and the latest of invasive insects, that there's been a lot of research put on it. And the research has been on a lot of the compounds that we use today to treat trees, which is pretty exciting. So I had an opportunity to talk to I was trying to get an arborist, a very well-known, you guys may know him, Christian Schultz. I have a lot of respect for him. He's a great guy. And I was asking him one day if he would want to do an interview with me, because I've done some interviews in the past. And he was kind of skeptic. In no disrespect, because maybe, not the lack of knowledge, but maybe the lack of his desire to want to be in plant healthcare, because he had a bad experience when he started in arbor culture. So after I talked to him and I explained that a lot of the compounds and a lot of the techniques that we use today are different, he warmed up to the idea. Again, he's a great climber. I have a lot of respect for him, and I can respect his decision not to want to talk plant healthcare. So maybe someday, Christian, if you're listening, we'll get you. So, trunk injection, again, it goes back to Leonardo da Vinci. So if you think about a tree anatomy and physiology, and I'm not going to try to inject this tree because it's old and we're getting late. So accessing the xylem of the tree, xylem up, phloem down. So it's just not as easy as that. In the last 16 years, working with Joe DeCola, who's the head of research at Arborjet, and Pete Wild, we've took it to the next step to figure out it. You have to understand the xylem and the micropores within the xylem to get the compound that you're putting in the tree from A to B. So that was their revolutionary breakthrough. Pete Wild, the owner of Arborjet, was having problems with hemlock woolly adelgid, another invasive insect, and guess where that one came from? Anyone want to take a stab and let me know where Gypsy Moth, Asian longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer, and one of the new ones we're going to talk, can anyone take a guess where they came from? Is anybody guessing, Jake?
Yeah, give it a second. We have to give it a second.
All right, I want to give you guys a second because I'm going to take a drink of my iced tea. All right. So if you guys guessed Asia, you're right. International global economy has been very detrimental to the arborists. Some say good because they're busier than they've ever been, and then if you're a tree preservationist, not so good. But accessing the xylem, we actually found out that some of the compounds that were being used a long time ago basically did not move in the vascular system of the tree. So you have to find a process to move that. They've been injecting trees. When Dutch elm disease, the research that came through that, now there's a compound out there that everybody uses for Dutch elm disease and actually preserve lots of trees. So there's a compound with emamectin that came out that was developed and ended up being the best product for emerald ash borer. So emamectin benzoate, which was a compound that came from ag. We messed around with it, got it to stay in solution, put it inside a tree. It translocated from A to B. Trees preserved. Any questions on plant health care?
Yeah, we sure do. Let's see, let's go
Are we up front?
right here.
Right here.
Why is it that, Eric is asking, why is it that where I live, Boonville, New York, we have huge, beautiful elm trees that are still living, all the smaller elms are dying or dead? Is it due to the spread by root graft?
Dutch elm disease can spread by root grafting. So if you have a group of elms that are together, the greatest question, the thing is that it could be a lot of things. One, it could be genetics. There are large, beautiful elm trees in Michigan that have never been treated also. It could be species of elm. There's other species of elms that are not affected by Dutch elm disease. American elms are the only ones that are dying right now. So could it be a species? Could it be a hybrid? Could it be so healthy that it could wall off the vascular wilt on its own? So there's a lot of variables. So my first thing would be is it an American elm? And has anybody treated it throughout that period? So there could be a residual compound in it. There's a lot of variables, or it just could be one of them beautiful elms that made it, like we have in Michigan that's never been touched.
Okay. The next one comes from Gerston. Is the trend a trend because of more readily, easily noticeable response and results? What about soil health and quality when we're talking about PHC?
All right, let's start at the beginning. I kind of missed the first half.
Gerston is asking, is getting into plant health care, moving into plant health care a trend because of more readily, easily noticeable response and results? What about soil health and quality?
I think it is a trend. You know what? I got into plant health care probably as early as I started climbing. All the tree care companies, the 2 or 3 that I worked for, no longer do tree work, and they all do plant health care. Plant health care is an evolving industry, and I think if you love the industry, it's easy to get into. Healthy soils, healthy trees is the trend. The generation that's coming into it does not want to use pesticides. And I don't blame them. I don't want to use pesticides. Using a pesticide a lot of time is a 911 response to something that, regardless if the soil's healthy, the tree's healthy, that insect or disease is going to kill the tree. Then you have to intervene and apply something. I think the trend is going to be not to have to use insecticides and fungicides one day. If you look at Canada, their pesticide ban, it's tough to move product into Canada because they have issues, but they're surviving without it. So I don't know how much longer in the US a lot of these compounds are going to be available. So the sooner you realize that and you start getting into more of a soil health, tree health, I think you'll be far ahead of the game. So yes, it's a good trend to be in.
Joseph is asking how long people have been spraying trees and are people getting away from spraying right now?
They've been spraying trees for thousands of years. When Dutch elm disease, pre-World War I, they were doing a lot of DDT, a lot of sprays, because they thought that to eliminate Dutch elm disease, you had to kill the beetles. So they've been spraying trees for a long time. The great story I was going to tell you about the history of arbor culture is you think about spraying trees. They used to have 1,000-gallon tanks. They would just go out and spray. When I first got in the business, the company I worked for used to charge by the gallon. So the more gallons you sprayed on a property, the more you charged them. So we'd mix a tank up with malathion back in the day, or Duraspan Pro, and if you charged them for a 300-gallon spray, you sprayed 300 gallons on the property. So we're getting away from it. But in the history of arbor culture, one of the older arborists, kind of a little guy, he told a story that back in the day with DDT, it would come in a powder and they'd have to use paddle agitation to get it in suspension in the tank. But because it was a powder, a wettable powder, it would plug the inlet and the screen on the inside of the tank. Because he was the thinnest guy and the only one that could fit down the port where they filled and put the pesticide in, they would dunk him in there, he'd hold his breath, swim over to the inlet, scrub it off, come back, and they would rinse him off with water. Not that it has anything to do with your question, but it kind of prompted me to talk about it. They've been spraying trees and using pesticides for a long time. I picked up in the 1940s, the City of Detroit forestry guide, and in the 30s and 40s, everything was sprayed with lead arsenic. So you think about that stuff never broke down. DDT on campus, they haven't used DDT on campus since the 60s. They can still detect it in the storeroom where they had it and where the turf was treated with it. So they've been spraying a long time, God, since the 1900s, beginning of the 1900s, probably before that. And even before that, before they were spraying trees, you can go back thousands of years, they were using copper, they were using ash, they were using a lot of compounds for pest control and disease suppression.
Matthew is asking, are there significant differences in injecting palms with their unique anatomy versus trees?
Yes. Because a palm has a vascular bundle, it's a grass, you have 1/3 of the diameter of a palm is conductive. So the nice thing about it, one injection site. As long as you pierce that vascular bundle and you get it in there, then you can treat the whole canopy, all the fronds. Whereas a tree, because everything's so separate, you have to go every 6 to 8 inches around the base of the tree. So there is a difference, and there's a difference because it is the vascular, there is a difference in the size and the physiological process of pulling up product. Different compounds have to be developed that are designed specifically for palms. Yes.
So David is asking, what is the easiest way to spot oak wilt?
Oak wilt, the easiest spot. It's spreading pretty fast. I'm not sure because I know I'm working with Ohio, Michigan, it's bad Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, I'm not sure if it's here. Oak wilt will have the wilting around August, as soon as it starts to get warm. Oak wilt is very similar to Dutch elm disease, where it's a vascular disease that plugs it. So it restricts the movement of water to that foliage. Neatest thing about oak wilt, other than bur oak blight, is that oak wilt, the leaves will fall off. So if you have a customer's yard in end of July, August, and next thing you know, all the leaves are falling off a tree and they're brown, they'll have necrotic spots and they're just dropping off the tree, that could be oak wilt. So what you need to do right now is you need to get some tissue samples from those recently defoliated trees. You need to get them into Purdue for testing. Right now, there's a lot of signs and symptoms, but there's a lot of other ailments in oaks. The only way you can truly tell is actually by turning it in and getting a tissue sample, a culture, to positively identify it.
Joe, Kyle wants to know about beech leaf disease. Do we know anything about it yet?
Man, you guys are good. Beech leaf disease is so new that nobody really knows anything. It's very similar to up in Michigan where we have MSU just called spruce decline, which is a new phenomenon in the Midwest where spruce trees are declining and nobody knows why. So there is research planned with the USDA and the state agencies to start applying some compounds and trying to figure out why we're having so much problems with the beech trees. You got the beech leaf disease, and we have a beech bark disease up by us that's a wind-borne spore from a fungus that gets in the microscopic stylus of an elm bark scale. The scale is so small to count them, you have to use a microscope. And when they pull their stylus out of the tree, that microscopic pore is enough for that spore from that disease to get into the vascular system of the tree. So we're even trying to learn stuff about that, but that disease, there's no recommendations for it just yet.
Greg wants to know, why is the price of tree health care so expensive? Seems like it's following the health care for elderly which can't afford their medication. There's a lot of dollars spent on research and development.
And I think what happens, and if I go back, let's go back 15 years ago when this gun came out, and the first product that Arborjet came out with was imidacloprid, Imajet. 15 years ago, that product was $900 for a liter, and this was $4,500. Went off patent, price dropped. Developed a new device because people were not happy with the cost. The new QuickJet Air, this is kind of obsolete now, half the cost. So I think the industry will regulate it. And I think, and I'm not just saying because I work for Arborjet, I know that the millions of dollars that are invested in research and development, something needs to be recouped. And I've been on the meetings, and we try to set the cost of product according to the market. I'll honestly say we've never set out to just put as high as we can. We did a lot of research on where the cost should be, and we're adjusting slowly, and the cost of a lot of the compounds are slowly going down. Hope that helps.
How would you treat mites on pecan trees?
Mites on pecan trees. I'm not a big fan for treating mites. Mites could get out of balance, and generally to me it's a health issue. I would make sure that pecan tree is as healthy as possible. There's mites on everything. There's probably mites on me right now, and there's probably mites on this stump. What happens is that you get IPM, you get to a threshold. Something has to get those trees to a threshold why the mites are a problem. Could it be a beneficial insect that feeds on the mites is knocked out of balance with some type of treatments? There are miticides out there to knock them down and then work on the health. Right off the top of my head, I'm not sure what I'd recommend on a pecan. And again, it goes down to, are the pecans being harvested? So you have to make sure that what you're using on that crop is allowed for food production. So I would look at health first, and I would look at beneficial insects in other ways if you're going to harvest the fruit. If not, give me a call. We'll figure something out.
Joe, some of the viewers were wanting to know about EAB and if we're ever going to get on top of it and win the battle. What are you hearing right now? And is there any, there's positive news, I'm sure, but.
Emerald ash borer, because when it first got here, and I've been on the ground floor with it with Michigan and Michigan State, Ohio State, Purdue, emerald ash borer will be a flat-headed borer in our landscape probably forever. But as I say that, we have to realize that we overplanted ash for a long time. And if you look at some of the forests in Michigan where emerald ash borers kind of came and went, ash trees are still there. I found a patch of ash trees, 1,200 acre farm to do research for ash trees 2 years ago, about 2 hours north of ground zero, and emerald ash borer was not on that property yet. So it's going to be cyclic. It's always going to be there. The compounds that we use today last longer than any product we've ever used. I think emerald ash borer is here to stay, unless those parasitic wasps that the USDA is trying to get, and that takes 15, 20, 30 years to see if those are even going to establish. I don't have enough confidence in that in controlling emerald ash borer, and I think it's going to be here forever. So if you got an ash tree and you love it, it's in your front yard, you're going to have to do something to it.
Pete wants to know if you have any recommendations for bacterial leaf scorch on oaks. He says it's pretty bad in New Jersey. Yeah,
you have to use, because it's a bacterium, you have to use a bactericide. There's a lot of great ones on the market. We did a lot of the research on bacterial leaf scorch on oak trees in Kentucky, and the Arbor OTC injected at the right time, because you have to get that in very early to get to the tree, to leaf, with great success. So again, yeah, there is something for individual trees that you can protect them from that disease, that bacteria. So, and it's very effective.
Somebody wants to know about rigging. Any kind of interesting history about rigging and the development of rigging? Rigging
is actually getting a heck of a lot more look in the last couple of years. You know, it used to be you take the tail end of your climbing line and you would rope down a branch, and that was only 20, 30 years ago. There's a lot of research, a lot of pull tests, a lot of dynamic loading. There's a lot of research going into rigging right now. And I think the science is going to catch up pretty soon. There's some great publications by ISA on it. There's some great guys that are looking at it as far as academia. I have not seen anything really new book or something on it that I was like, wow, revolutionary. But I know the load testing, and every ISA chapter event I go to now, they're talking about it. Load test, pull test, shock on lines, shock on beaners. They're doing a lot of research on it right now. So hopefully, when in doubt, rope it out, and you know, that was my motto. And just don't try to make it too big. You know, there's a recent Facebook video going on where the guy's hanging on a rope and he's trying to rig out this big lead, and his groundy wasn't ready and he let it fly, and the guy did a Superman through the air. I'm not sure if you guys seen that yet, but that's pretty new. So getting into a company or like North American Training or Arbor Masters who have been doing all this research, getting into one of their classes, I think that'd be a great tool to help you learn a little bit more about rigging.
Going back to pests, are there any pests that specifically for tree pests, have there been any pests that have ever been eradicated?
I asked the USDA that, and I don't think, you know what, I don't think, there's probably a lot of them that came here that never survived, but anything that's been aggressive enough to get established, no, it's never been eradicated. Everything that we go back to, even tussock moth in the 1800s, they're still here. I think we found ways to keep them in check, but nothing eradicated. I think maybe the closest, if I think you recall, is Asian longhorn beetle. Asian longhorn beetle was actually eradicated, and I'm going to use the quotation marks, eradicated in Chicago and Toronto, where they've had the insect there, they were aggressive, and they haven't found it since. There's a lot of arborists, there's a lot of naysayers. I think it's probably still there, it hasn't been found. But nothing I can think of that's been totally eradicated comes to mind.
TC Mazer is asking if there are plans in research and development for more biological control in fighting insects and disease. Where is IPM headed?
That's a great question. I know at Arborjet, we're looking at that. We're always trying to look at the trend because we do a lot of work internationally, and there's areas where you can't use. Biological is the future, very similar to soil health, proper soils, tree nutrition. We got to go there. We have to do it. You think about the days of maybe there's tree whisperers. I don't know if you guys ever seen the guy at the trade show. I kind of laughed, but we have to find a way to use less and less of harsh compounds in the environment. And it's kind of our duty, not only as arborists, by arborist manufacturers like Arborjet. And I will tell you that we are in our lab, and we are setting up a tree research lab to find biologicals and botanicals that are safer alternative than your day-to-day products that we're using today. So we're trying very hard. A lot of them, it comes down to we may have to use a tougher compound to get it to a point where it's controllable, and then use biologicals and botanicals to maintain it afterwards. So there is a lot of research we are trying.
Trevor Blankenship is asking if you have any pointers on writing an EAB plan for a city.
Oh yeah. It's very important. I'll start off with, if you're going to write a plan for EAB for a community, the first thing they need to do is make sure that you have a survey. If they don't survey their trees, they don't know what they got, you can't do anything about a plan. So the quick they got to survey them. If you know what the city has and you know the diameters and you know the classification and the health of the trees, goes back to tree check, classifying trees 1 to 5, as far as 1 being beautiful, 5 being removals. So you got to get a survey and you got to classify the trees. And then you can kind of do all kinds of things past that. Get my information. If you have a city and you want some help, please call me. I'll help more than be gladly to help you work on a city plan.
Ben wants to know, and this is up in your neck of the woods, he wants to know if you have any idea what Michigan's plan for EAB is for treatment, removal, replacement.
Believe it or not, emerald ash borer, I'm 20 miles from ground zero. I'm in Macomb Township, so I'm real close to where it all started. I had 3 ash trees along my property by the creek. 2 died from emerald ash borer, and 1 I treated was in the fence. I have not treated that tree since, so it's been 7 or 8 years. I'm not recommending that, but I'm trying to determine the level of infestation. For ground zero, the level of infestation in Michigan is real low. Is it still there? Yes. I did a walk the other day around the block. There was a stump where someone had cut an ash tree down 10 years ago and it suckered out. Well, they let the suckers go, and now each sucker got to be a 4 to 6 inch multi-stem ash tree. Well, last year emerald ash borer got it again. So it's still around. It's going to be very similar to a birch tree. If you want it, you may have to have a treatment program or plant health care. There's a lot of people that still are maintaining their ash trees up there because it's an integral part of their landscape. And now it's 15 years bigger, so it's even more important. So I think we weeded through all the bad trees. Any tree that wanted to be preserved is on a program. The level of emerald ash borer is so low, but it's still there. So guys, if the tree's worth protecting, we're going to continue to treat them as long as we need to, or as long as that customer wants to save that tree.
Bob wants to know, why don't we have the same success with injectable fungicides as we do with insecticides? Is that being studied? And he would love to hear something for that's a hard word to say. Araphanos, leaf spot.
Anthracnose.
Anthracnose, yeah. Oh, there you go, anthracnose, leaf spot.
Yeah, I got that one, Jake.
You're the expert,
Toss you a
not me.
bone on that one. Fungicides are improving. Insecticides kill a tree. There's been a lot more research on insecticides because that kills the tree. Fungicides, yes, we're working on it. There are things in the works. A lot of the compounds that we use today are 20, 30, 40-year-old compounds as far as fungicides. It goes back to the time and effort it takes to put that in there. If you're a manufacturer, money's in bugs. But we can't ignore the fact that we talk about invasive insects. We didn't talk about the invasive diseases. And more of them are coming, so you're right. We need to do a better job at bringing to market more options for arborists for some of the diseases. And I honestly think that these diseases over a time period are getting more aggressive because it's a living organism, just like a lot of other things. Dutch elm disease. The Dutch elm disease strain, and this is just me talking from my observations, are killing trees faster than it did years ago. So there is something going on, and we do need to do a better job on working on fungicides and bactericides as injectables for trees.
Dylan wants to know that we talk a lot about invasive insects and diseases. What about introduced and invasive trees and other plant effects on urban forestry and arboriculture?
Oh, that's insects. Invasive insects are like a small part of the pie. When you start getting into other invasives like plants and trees, and we can go back, and if you could go back in time and kick Charles Darwin in the ass, or the HMS Beagle that started going around the world and bringing all these trees in here that became invasives, we probably would. It's kind of a pain in the butt. We look at plants, invasive plants. If you get down south, kudzu, buckthorn up by us, these invasive plants are horrible. And again, it goes back to the 50,000 invasives weren't just insects and diseases. It was plants, it was mollusks. It's ships coming down the St. Lawrence Seaway dumping their bilge. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. It's a global market. It's a small world today. In invasives, not only aquatic plants or insects or birds, it's going to get worse and worse. So that's why you ask me, plant healthcare is a wave of the future, because it is going to get worse. And we need to have guys on the ground that are looking for this and paying attention for it and jumping on board to save some of these trees.
Any final thoughts on plant healthcare or any of the other topics that you talked about tonight?
Yeah, we got to, plant healthcare. I'm a tree dork. I'm not going to lie. I love trees. I love climbing still. I'm amazed that we have these large living organisms on the planet, and we're all part of an amazing industry where we get to take care of them. A lot of you guys may not be doing plant health care, and a lot of you guys may be thinking about it. A lot of you guys may just be doing plant health care and not climbing anymore. But whatever you're doing, as long as we're taking care of these beautiful specimens for our clients, I'm in. And anything I could do to help you guys, please let me know. I think we need more people getting into it. I'm very fortunate in my position that I get to work with Michigan State Forestry and their forestry club. And I get to go in there and talk to them about urban forestry and arboriculture. And Michigan State last year, because of the need, actually reinstated their urban forestry program. So hopefully we start getting more and more people into this industry, because I think plant healthcare is going to grow, and we need to want people that want to do it.
Our friend Jason Dudick is asking, what is the best chemical to kill buckthorn?
God, there's so many herbicides. What we use up north is Tordon. There's a bunch of different Tordon products, such as a herbicide, so that once you cut that down, you have to paint that top. It's a pain in the butt, but it works really well. So look for Tordon. Great herbicide. But be careful, leeches. So if you put it in, you can kill anything around it too. So, all right, I think, man, we wrapped up a lot of great questions. You guys did a great job tonight with some beautiful questions. Again, I got my name and contact up here. Reach out to TreeStuff. If you got something that's really cool that you got hanging around on the wall that would be something for urban forestry, or you want to put in the museum at one day with your name on it, let me know. I would love to help you guys out, give you some recognition. So without any other questions, I think we're probably gonna.
Where are you gonna be next, Joe? Where can people see you in person? Is there any place? I know you're open to contacting.
My next event is.
Where are you gonna be?
I'll be at next week. I'm at Michigan's ISA chapter, so that's ArborCon, Michigan's ISA chapter, and then I'll be in Ontario. Actually, I'm taking this history of arboriculture. The saddles is going to Ontario, and then I will actually be at. I'll be doing the history at Ohio ISA also. So those are the next three events. So February, I'm at all the ISA events, and I was just at Indiana. So, and if I'm not at a
I get a lot of visitors to the cave.
I will lock the cabinet in the back, so if you guys seen that.
Say what you were saying last about what you were doing, where you're going.
Oh yeah. Well, next week is Michigan's ISA. It's called ArborCon. I'll be there for 3 days. That's Michigan ISA chapter. The week after that, I will be in Ontario for Ontario ISA. And then the last week in February is Ohio ISA. So next three things you'll have, if you're going to any one of those ISA events, let me know. If you don't do the ISA events and you're nearby and you just want to have a soda pop, man, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you guys out.
Any plans to visit the Badger State anytime soon?
The Badger State? I love Wisconsin. And they usually have their Wisconsin Arbor Show. I think that's the 17th and 18th. I will not be attending that. Jeff Palmer will be there, who is my colleague from Minnesota. If you go there and you see him, make him buy you something or make him treat you to a pop or lunch. So Jeff will be there. I stay in the Great Lakes states, Chicago. I do get up there. I was just at the Northern Industry Green Show in Minnesota. And then Canada, all you Canadian guys. Canada's my territory, so I'm trying to get more involved with the Prairie chapter, Ontario chapter. I'll be going to Nova Scotia soon because they just found EAB, so I'm pretty accessible. And if I'm not, I'm in my office.
Good deal. Well, Joe, thanks very much, and I think Nick's going to wrap things up for us.
Yeah, hey, thank you guys. Again, thanks Nick, thank you guys, thanks TreeStuff. It was kind of fun to be part of the group today because I remember the beginning of TreeStuff, and kudos to you guys for what you've been doing. And again, if you need me, reach out to me. Have a good night.
All right, well, that was a wrap. Thank you, Joe, for putting together such a great presentation for us, for taking the time to do all this and to maintain it, and just for doing it in general. If you go to one of the shows that Joe has this exhibit at, you got to stop by, get hands-on with this stuff. It is really cool. It's very exciting, and there's a lot to learn. Joe can talk for way longer than he talked tonight and tell you anything you want to know about all this stuff. Thanks again to the crew. Thanks to the ISA for their support. Always like to take an opportunity and talk about Fallen Families Fund. We started a fully registered 503c charity last year. 100% of all donations and fundraising go directly towards cash grants that the charity provides to individuals and families that are in need or people that have lost an earner because of their association and work in tree care. So if you or someone you know has been disabled or been unable to work for some reason, fill out an application on the website, fallenfamiliesfund.org, and we'll see what we can do to help you out. If you're at an event, buy a t-shirt, support a raffle, do something to help this great cause. We really appreciate that. A lot of great webinars coming up this year. We're looking at doing a factory tour with Rock Exotica later in the year. We've got Nick Araya coming up at the end of this month. He'll be talking about business fundamentals, things that have helped Tree Care LA stand out in a premier market, and really just sharing some of the things that's made him super successful and hopefully can make you successful. I think that webinar is going to be really interesting for entrepreneurs of all levels, whether you're just starting out or you're a veteran. So definitely tune into that one. If you didn't watch the Samson webinar we did, check that out. It was awesome. We were at the factory. We followed the production of rope all the way from fiber to finished packaging, testing, did some drop tests, tons of learnings. We debunked a bunch of rope myths, found out about Sharpie on your rope, frozen and muddy ropes. Are they stronger or weaker? Can you use diesel fuel to clean sap off? Strangely enough, the answer was yes. Find out the answers to those questions and more. Watch the Samson webinar that we just published. Like our Facebook page, tell your friends, and stay tuned for more from this really great series. So thanks so much for watching and have a great day. Stay safe out there.